Hello and welcome to the 10th lecture of Python Concepts, Object-Oriented Programming or class. So in the previous lecture, we have actually explored a very fundamental and very necessary component of programming, that is functions, and we have learned how to use functions to automate our blocks of codes and how to reduce manual portions. We have also learned how to use functions in order to use for loops and conditionals like if statements with a great efficiency. And now this particular lecture is kind of different because all of the previous lectures, if you have followed through it, those were focused on using variables and modifying their values and the functionalities according to our need. But this is kind of different because here we will be introduced to kind of real world development of programming by being introduced to objects and classes. So what are actually classes? Classes are actually behaviors, a set of behaviors that is set for objects, and objects are stuff that have different attributes, like different properties that something has. So think of a house. In a house, there's a certain blueprint that actually defines how the house is. So a class is kind of an equivalent of a blueprint. And when you make a house, those house has so many components. And those components are equivalent to objects. And each object, like a door that can open and shut, a window can open and shut, and the other components that also have their specific functionalities. So very similarly, objects also have specific functionalities, and you can actually define a class, and for each object inside it, you can actually define specific functionalities or attributes. So that's kind of a background of how to be introduced to object-oriented programming. Now let's do very simple object-oriented programming associated code so that we can get used to all the terminologies and we can understand what's going on here in object-oriented programming. So for that, let's say we want to make a class named car. So in this car, we will actually store several sets of information, like what makes are those, what models are those, and from which years models are those. And also these kind of attributes we will define. And after that, we want to see if we call or if we initiate a class with a specific attributes for an object, then what it shows for a particular model. So this is kind of a syntax for object-oriented programming. We start with the keyword class. That means that you are actually initiating a class called a car. And this also looks like how we write a function. And we start with the keyword def, and we initiate the instance of a class with 2 underscores and then init keyword and then another 2 underscores. That actually alerts Python that you are starting a class. And inside the arguments, you have to pass an as the first argument called self. It will always be there, and the other attributes that you want to assign to your objects. So for the self keyword, what is happening is that you are making this instance, you are making this class to the every available instances. And inside that definition block, the initiation block, you can actually define the attributes. For example, to do that, you have to actually make it under the self keyword. So you have to use self dot. So let's say you have 3 attributes, make, model, and year. So self.make, let's say you have give it a name, make, and then a model, and then year. And also what you want to do is that you want to see what happens if you call this class. And that's why you are initiating another def. When we are working inside a class, we don't call them functions anymore, we call them methods, so that they can be applied to the class objects. And then let's say you have a long name, and that for that long name you are actually defining a string inside which you will show the year, you will show the model, and you will show the make of the car of yours, and after that you will return that long name. So what is happening is that you are actually defining your car in terms of your make, model, and year. And when you are calling the class car, that will know that you are calling your specific car with specific make, model, and year, this kind of attributes. Remember how we have defined class with objects with different attributes. So if it was a house, it will have different properties, different objects, different elements with different attributes, like several doors or windows or walls, something like that. So similarly, what is happening here for car, you are also defining different attributes of your objects. And then you have initiated your method under which you are defining all the attributes, and then you are trying to return those attributes. You are trying to see them. And then let's say you are defining my new car as an instance of your class car, under which you are defining a very specific set of attributes like Toyota, RAV4, and 2012. And when you run this, you can see actually 2012 Toyota RAV4, because you are printing my new car. Under this my new car instance, you are actually trying to get description. So this method that you have initiated, which has actually stored all the attributes. This may sound kind of hazy at first, but after you write a few blocks of code in object-oriented programming, everything will start to make sense. So let's say you want to include another value, or you want to set a value to a particular attribute. So what I have done is that is the same block of code. What modification I have made is that, let's say you want to include the odometer reading here also. So for that, you have to actually write under the self keyword, you have to pass another argument, odometer reading, and set a value for this. Let's say initially it's 0. So after that, what we have done is that we have introduced another method called read odometer, which only has the self keyword, self attribute, because we don't have to define it separately here, because we have already set the value here. And what it does is that when we invoke this method, it will print the current mileage, and it will convert the value, the 0, to a string, and then it will call it under self, and it will print the odometer reading. So what we have done is the same thing, my new car, and then we print my car description, what I have already done. And what we add is that my new car, under this instance, we are asking read odometer, this method, and when we are calling this method, it will print this self odometer reading, which is 0. Now, can we actually modify it? Yes, absolutely. That is one of the main purposes of ours, that we can modify attributes through a method. So let's say you want to update the odometer after buying a new car, you are actually running it. So what we have done is that aside from the make, model, and year, you are actually trying to update the odometer. So for that, you have, aside from the self keyword, you have to also pass the argument mileage. And let's say you want to update the mileage. And
for that, you have to actually call this instance, my new car, under this method, update automator, with this argument 500. Let's say you have run for 500 miles and you want to update it. And when you call with this particular value, what it will do is that under this my new car instance, it will invoke this method update parameter, and then it will, as it is already set for mileage, current mileage, it will print current mileage. After converting to string, it will show self.odometer reading. What is odometer reading? That is currently 500, as I'm calling with this. So that's kind of a very short introduction to object-oriented programming. By implementing those in the later videos, we'll try to make some small applets or games, or we'll try to implement for data analysis at large scale, so that all can make sense. And we will also we'll definitely implement the earlier ideas that we have learned, like functions and conditionals and the basic ideas of coding. And the last note about class is that you can also import classes to, let's say you have saved this block of code in a Python file, .py file, and you can call it to another code. Let's say from, let's say you have saved it in the name of car.py, then you can actually import it from car, import car, and then continue to work on these. Every module or instances will be available at your disposal, so that you can actually separate your chunks of codes to increase your efficiency. So later in our projects, it will become more obvious, and we will see how to divide our chunk of codes to make our writing of code very clean and sleek. And in the next class, we'll see how to deal with files. Until then, happy coding.